A deal unlike any other. The city skyline glittered as James Thornton stood at the edge of his penthouse balcony, a crystal tumbler of bourbon in hand. To the world, he was the epitome of success. At 43 years old, a self-made billionaire, a titan of real estate, and an unrelenting force in boardrooms. But to James, the cold wind sweeping across his face that evening was a chilling reminder of the emptiness that gnawed at his soul. His penthouse was enormous, filled with designer furniture, priceless art, and the latest technology. Yet it was eerily quiet. No laughter echoed through the halls, no footsteps of a child running to greet him, no warm voice calling him home. Each evening, he found himself staring out at the bustling city below, longing for something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't companionship. He'd had plenty of that. Models, socialites, and even a brief torrid relationship with a pop star had graced his arm at galas, but none of them stayed long enough to see the man behind the polished veneer. And James was tired of the superficial. What he wanted now was real, something enduring, someone to carry his name, his legacy. A child. But James was also a realist. He'd seen friends entangled in messy divorces, prenuptial disputes, and child custody battles. He didn't want the complications of a relationship. What he needed was a solution, one that would satisfy his desire for a family without the risks of emotional entanglements. One name lingered in his thoughts: Clara, the young woman he'd noticed every day for the past month just outside his corporate headquarters. She wasn't like the other panhandlers who dotted the city streets. Clara had a quiet dignity about her. She always sat cross-legged on the corner, a small stack of books beside her, a sign that simply read, "Hungry but hopeful. Anything else." She was young, no older than 25, and though her clothes were worn, her posture was straight, her head held high. James had never spoken to her, but he'd seen the way she interacted with passersby. She always said thank you with a warm smile, even if someone tossed only spare change her way. There was intelligence in her eyes, a resilience that intrigued him. He often wondered how someone like her ended up on the streets. That evening, James made a decision that would set a series of events in motion he couldn't have foreseen. The next day, he called his lawyer, Marcus Reed. "You want to do what?" Marcus had asked, his voice incredulous. "I want to hire a surrogate," James had said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But not through the usual channels. I want someone who isn't tied to the lifestyle of wealth and privilege. Someone grounded. And this woman, you want to recruit her off the street." "James, this could backfire in more ways than I can count." "I've thought it through," James insisted. "She's intelligent, resourceful, and most importantly, she needs a fresh start. I can offer her that." After several rounds of legal discussions, Marcus reluctantly drafted the contract. The next day, James descended from his high-rise tower, walking the bustling streets until he reached Clara's corner. She was there, as always, engrossed in a tattered paperback. She didn't notice him at first, so he cleared his throat. Clara looked up, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady despite her circumstances. "Yes," James said, holding out a business card. "I have a proposition for you." Her brow furrowed as she read the card. It bore only his name, James Thornton, and his private number. "What kind of proposition?" she asked cautiously. "Not here," he replied. "There's a cafe across the street. I'd like to discuss it over coffee." Clara hesitated, studying him. Her life on the streets had taught her to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true. But there was something genuine in his demeanor, and the idea of a warm drink on a cold day was too tempting to pass up. "All right," she said, gathering her belongings. At the cafe, James explained his offer. Clara listened in stunned silence as he laid out the terms: medical care, a safe place to live, and financial compensation that would allow her to rebuild her life. In return, she would carry his child, conceived through artificial insemination, with no physical contact involved. "I don't understand," she said finally. Why me? You're resilient, James said simply. You've faced hardships and come out stronger. That's the kind of person I want raising my child during pregnancy. Clara's gaze turned steely. And afterward, what happens to me? You'll have the financial means to start over, James assured her. A fresh start. And the baby? She pressed. I won't have any rights. That's correct, James said evenly. The contract will be ironclad. Clara leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. It's a lot to process. Take your time, James said, sliding the contract across the table. But know this, I'm offering you a way out, a chance to rewrite your story. For the next 2 days, Clara stayed up late reading every line of the contract. She had a law degree, or at least most of one. She'd been forced to drop out after her father's death left her drowning in debt. As she pored over the legalese, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision before her. On the 3rd day, Clara called James. I'll do it, she said, but I have one condition. What's that? He asked. I want to finish my degree, she said. If I'm going to be living in your home, I want access to online courses. James was surprised but impressed. Agreed. A fragile arrangement. Clara arrived at James Thornton's estate 2 days later with a duffel bag containing her only possessions, 3 changes of clothes, a pair of worn sneakers, and her books. The sprawling mansion loomed like a fortress, its towering gates creaking open to reveal manicured gardens, fountains, and a driveway that seemed to stretch forever. Clara felt like an outsider in a world she didn't belong to, and the thought made her hesitate. James greeted her at the door, impeccably dressed as always, though his usual businesslike demeanor softened when he saw her. Welcome, Clara, he said, stepping aside to let her in. I hope you'll find everything to your liking. The interior of the house was just as intimidating as the exterior. Polished marble floors, chandeliers that sparkled like constellations, and furniture that looked too expensive to touch. Clara felt small and out of place, but she squared her shoulders and met James's gaze. It's beautiful, she said, though she secretly thought it was too beautiful. It felt like a museum, not a home. James nodded and motioned for an older woman to join them. This is Evelyn, the house manager. She'll make sure you have everything you need. Evelyn, with her warm smile and no-nonsense attitude, immediately made Clara feel more at ease. Come with me, dear, she said, leading Clara down a long hallway. We've set up the guest suite for you. The suite was larger than most apartments Clara had lived in, with a king-sized bed, a private bathroom, and a view of the gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly. Clara set her bag down on the edge of the bed, feeling a pang of discomfort. She wasn't used to luxury, and she wasn't sure she ever would be. Is there anything else you need? Evelyn asked, her kind eyes studying Clara. Clara hesitated before shaking her head. No, thank you. Evelyn smiled and patted her hand. You let me know if you change your mind. Dinner will be at 7. Once alone, Clara took a deep breath and let herself sit on the edge of the bed. She'd made her decision, and now there was no turning back. The contract was signed, the terms agreed upon. She was here to fulfill her part of the deal. And yet, as she gazed out at the pristine gardens, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just stepped into something far more complicated than she'd anticipated. Adjusting to the arrangement, the first week was awkward. James was busy with work, and Clara rarely saw him. Evelyn and the rest of the staff made sure she was comfortable, but Clara often felt like an invisible presence in a house that wasn't truly hers. She spent her days exploring the library, a room so vast it had a spiral staircase leading to a second level, and attending her online classes. James had kept his promise, arranging for her to enroll in a law program that allowed her to pick up where she had left off. For the first time in years, Clara felt like she was reclaiming a piece of herself. She threw herself into her studies, grateful for the distraction. One evening, as she was reading in the library, James appeared in the doorway. He looked tired, His tie loosened, and his sleeves rolled up, but he offered her a small smile. "How are you settling in?" he asked, his voice gentler than she expected. Clara set her book down and stood. "It's a lot to get used to, but I'm managing." James nodded, stepping further into the room. "I know it's an unusual situation. If there's anything you need, anything at all, let me know." "Thank you," Clara said, unsure of what else to say. She wasn't used to people like James, men who wielded power and wealth as effortlessly as breathing. But there was something about him that intrigued her. Beneath the polished exterior, she sensed a loneliness that mirrored her own. Before he could leave, she added, "This house, it's beautiful, but it feels so empty." James paused, his expression unreadable. "It hasn't felt like a home in a long time," he admitted quietly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then James straightened, as if shaking off the vulnerability. "Good night, Clara." "Good night," she replied, watching him disappear down the hallway. The first milestones. The medical process began shortly after Clara settled in. James insisted on only the best care, and Dr. Olivia Harper, a renowned fertility specialist, oversaw every detail. The first appointment was nerve-wracking for Clara. The sterile white walls of the clinic reminded her of hospitals, of loss, of the struggles that had brought her to this point. James was there for every appointment, though he often seemed as nervous as she was. He paced the waiting room while Clara underwent tests, his phone forgotten in his hand. When the artificial insemination procedure was complete, Clara noticed him clench his fists as though bracing for impact. "You don't have to be here for all of this," she told him as they left the clinic one day. "I can handle it." James looked at her, his expression serious. "I want to be here. This is important to me." His words lingered with Clara long after they returned to the house. A few weeks later, the results came back. Clara was pregnant. The news hit her harder than she expected. She'd known this was the goal, of course, but seeing the confirmation in black and white made it real. She was carrying a life that wasn't hers to keep. James was equally stunned when Dr. Harper gave them the news. For a moment, he simply stared at the ultrasound image, the faint flutter of a heartbeat on the screen. Then he looked at Clara. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have." Clara nodded, unsure how to respond. She'd made peace with her role in this arrangement, but seeing James's reaction made her realize just how much this meant to him. For the first time, she wondered if she was prepared for the emotional weight of what she'd agreed to. A bond begins to form. As the weeks turned into months, Clara and James began to spend more time together. It was unavoidable, given the circumstances, but it also felt natural. They found themselves sharing meals, talking about everything from literature to philosophy to their favorite childhood memories. James was surprisingly funny, and Clara often caught herself laughing at his dry wit. One evening, Clara found James in the nursery. He was assembling a crib, his sleeves rolled up, and his brow furrowed in concentration. She leaned against the doorway, watching him struggle with the instructions. "Need some help?" she teased. James looked up, his face lighting up with a rare smile. "I'm beginning to think I should have hired a professional." Clara stepped into the room, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside him. Together, they worked on the crib, their hands brushing occasionally as they passed tools back and forth. By the time they finished, it was nearly midnight, but the crib stood proudly in the center of the room. "It's perfect," Clara said, running her hand along the smooth wood. James looked at her, his gaze soft. "It's for the baby," he said, "but it wouldn't be here without you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Clara met his eyes, and for the first time, she saw something beyond gratitude. Something deeper. It terrified her. "I should get some rest," she said quickly, standing. James nodded, though his expression was unreadable. "Good night, Clara." As she left the room, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that their carefully constructed boundaries were beginning to blur, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that. Uncharted territory. The weeks after the pregnancy was confirmed brought both joy and tension into the Thornton mansion. Clara's body began to change as the new life inside her grew. She felt a strange mix of excitement and trepidation, knowing that this wasn't just her journey, but also James's, and that her role was meant to end as soon as the child was born. Yet every passing day seemed to complicate that neat contractual arrangement. The unexpected shift. James Thornton was not a man accustomed to letting his guard down. Yet Clara was slowly dismantling the walls he had so carefully constructed. It wasn't intentional, at least, not on her part. There was something about her that disarmed him. Her intelligence, her resilience, the quiet humor she wielded like a shield against the world. All of it fascinated him. But it wasn't just fascination. James found himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't anticipated. He caught himself lingering over breakfast, where Clara would sit with her textbooks spread across the table, explaining legal theories with a passion that reminded him of his early days building his empire. He started looking forward to their evening walks through the garden, where she would talk about her favorite authors or her plans to use her education to help others once her part in this arrangement was over. One night, as they sat on a stone bench beneath the stars, Clara asked him a question that stopped him cold. "Why did you choose me?" James hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of her tone. He took a moment before answering. "I've watched a lot of people in my life, Clara. I've seen what desperation does to them, how it breaks them. But you never let it break you. You're different." She tilted her head, studying him. "Different how?" "You're strong," he said simply. "And I admire that." Clara looked away, her hand unconsciously resting on her growing belly. "Strength is just a necessity when you don't have a choice," she said softly. "But it's nice to hear someone sees it as something more." For the first time, James noticed the vulnerability beneath her strength, and it stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't sure what it was, but it scared him. A life together, but apart. Clara's pregnancy brought new challenges, both physical and emotional. She began to experience morning sickness, fatigue, and mood swings. James, true to his word, made sure she had the best care. Evelyn ensured Clara ate balanced meals, rested enough, and avoided stress. But it wasn't the physical toll that weighed on Clara the most. It was the growing bond she felt with the baby and, to her dismay, with James. The line between what was business and what was personal blurred further with each passing day. James began attending not just the important medical appointments, but also the routine checkups. He asked questions, learned about the baby's development, and even started reading parenting books, though he tried to hide them behind his business journals. Clara found it endearing, though she tried not to let it show. One evening, James surprised her with a small gift, a leather-bound journal. "What's this for?" Clara asked, turning it over in her hands. "For you," James said, a little awkwardly. "I thought you might like to keep a record of everything. For the baby, maybe." Clara opened the journal and ran her fingers over the blank pages. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "It's thoughtful." James shrugged, but she could see the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Not to Clara. It was yet another sign that their arrangement was evolving into something neither of them had planned for. The first scare. At 5 months pregnant, Clara experienced her first major complication. She had been walking in the garden when she felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her abdomen. Panic gripped her as she doubled over, clutching her stomach. Evelyn, who had been nearby, rushed to her side and called for James. Within minutes, James was at her side, his face pale and his hands shaking as he helped her into his car. "We're going to the hospital," he said firmly, his voice betraying the fear he was trying to suppress. The drive was tense, neither of them speaking as James navigated through the city traffic with white-knuckled determination. Clara fought back tears, terrified that something was wrong with the baby. She hadn't realized how deeply she cared until that moment. At the hospital, Dr. Harper reassured them that the baby was fine. "It's just round ligament pain," she explained. "Very common in pregnancy. But Clara, you need to take it easy. No more long walks or overexerting yourself." Relief washed over both of them, though James didn't let go of Clara's hand until long after the doctor had left. "You scared me," he admitted quietly, his voice hoarse. "I scared myself," Clara said, tears finally spilling over. "I thought." James squeezed her hand, his gaze steady. "The baby is fine. You're fine. That's all that matters." In that moment, the boundaries they had tried so hard to maintain crumbled a little more. A new kind of normal. After the scare, James became even more protective of Clara. He had a chair set up in the garden so she could still enjoy the fresh air without overexerting herself. He insisted on carrying her books, her tea, anything that might add strain. Clara found it both endearing and slightly annoying. "You know I'm not made of glass, right?" she teased one evening as he brought her a blanket for the cool night air. "I know," James said, sitting beside her, "but I'm not taking any chances." They fell into an easy rhythm, their lives slowly intertwining in ways that felt natural despite the unusual circumstances. James opened up about his childhood, revealing a side of himself Clara hadn't seen before. He talked about growing up in a modest home, losing his parents young, and building his empire from scratch. "I never had anyone to lean on," he admitted one night. "Everything I've done alone. Until now." Clara didn't know how to respond, so she simply reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. The nursery. By the 7th month of Clara's pregnancy, the nursery was nearly complete. James had spared no expense, hiring the best designers to create a space that was both elegant and cozy. But it was Clara who added the personal touches. A mobile of stars she made herself, a quilt she sewed from fabric scraps Evelyn had found in storage. One night, as they stood in the nursery, James watched Clara arrange the quilt in the crib. "You're amazing, you know that," he said suddenly. Clara looked up, startled. "What?" "You've been through so much, and yet here you are, making quilts and mobiles, and studying law on top of it all. It's inspiring." Clara felt her cheeks flush. "I'm just doing what I can." James stepped closer, his gaze intense. "You're doing more than that, Clara. You're changing my life." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of his words hanging between them. Clara wanted to say something, anything, but before she could, James reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You should rest," he said softly, stepping back. "It's been a long day." Clara nodded, her heart pounding as she left the room. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at her, as if she were the most important thing in his world. The cracks in the walls. By the 8th month of Clara's pregnancy, the once clear boundaries of their arrangement were a distant memory. What had begun as a strictly professional agreement had morphed into something unspoken, something neither Clara nor James dared to name. Yet the tension between them was palpable, simmering beneath every conversation, every shared glance. A vulnerable moment. One rainy evening, James returned home earlier than usual, the weight of a long day visible on the tight set of his shoulders. He found Clara in the library, sitting in her favorite armchair with a blanket draped over her lap. She was reading aloud from a book of children's stories, her voice soft and melodic. James paused in the doorway, watching her. "You're practicing already," he said, his voice breaking the quiet. Clara looked up, smiling faintly. "Just getting ready for the big debut," she said, patting her belly. They seemed to like it. Lots of movement tonight. James stepped into the room, setting his briefcase down. "Mind if I join you?" Clara shook her head, motioning to the chair across from her. "Not at all." For the next hour, they read together, alternating stories. James was surprisingly good at creating voices for the characters, and Clara found herself laughing more than she had in weeks. When the clock struck 10, she set the book aside and sighed. "Do you ever wonder," she said hesitantly, "what it's going to feel like when this is over?" James frowned. "What do you mean?" "When the baby is here," Clara said, her voice quieter now. "When I leave." The words hung heavy in the air. James looked at her, his eyes shadowed with an emotion Clara couldn't quite decipher. "I don't want to think about that," he said finally. "But we have to." Clara pressed, her throat tightening. That was the deal. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know what the deal was. But deals change, Clara. People change." Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. "James, what are you saying?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I'm saying I don't want this to end. Not like that." Clara's breath caught. She wanted to believe him, to trust the sincerity in his voice. But the fear of hoping for too much held her back. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "You're just caught up in the moment." James reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "I've spent my entire life building walls, Clara. You've torn them down without even trying. Don't tell me this is just a moment." Tears pricked Clara's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can let go." "Then don't," James said softly. "Stay." The word lingered between them, full of possibility and uncertainty. The storm. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. James's words played over and over in her mind, filling her with equal parts hope and fear. She knew her feelings for him had grown beyond what the contract allowed, but she had been too afraid to admit it. Now it felt as if everything was teetering on the edge of something bigger, something life-changing. The storm outside mirrored her inner turmoil. Lightning flashed through the large windows of her suite, illuminating the room in sharp bursts of light. When a particularly loud clap of thunder shook the house, Clara sat up, her heart racing. A knock at her door startled her. Before she could respond, James stepped inside, his expression apologetic. "Sorry to bother you," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I just wanted to check on you. The storm's pretty intense." Clara managed a small smile. "I'm fine. Just restless." James hesitated before crossing the room and sitting on the edge of the chair by her bed. "Me too," he admitted. "I couldn't stop thinking about what we talked about earlier." Clara swallowed hard. And I meant what I said," James replied, his voice steady. "I don't want you to leave. I want you to stay, not just for the baby, but for me. For us." Tears welled in Clara's eyes again, but this time she didn't try to hide them. "James, I know it's complicated," he said, leaning closer, "but I've spent my life chasing success, thinking it would make me happy. It didn't. You did." The vulnerability in his voice broke through Clara's defenses. She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of wanting this too much, of losing it." James lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You're not going to lose it," he said firmly. "We'll figure it out together." For the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to believe in the possibility of happiness. The nursery revelation. The following week, James surprised Clara by taking a day off work to spend with her. They toured the nursery together, James proudly showing her every detail. He had even added a rocking chair beside the crib, which he painted himself in soft pastel colors. "This is beautiful," Clara said, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "You've thought of everything." "Not everything," James said, his tone serious. "There's one more thing I wanted to ask you." Clara turned to him, her heart pounding. "What is it?" James took a deep breath. "I know this wasn't part of the original plan, but I want you to be part of this baby's life, not just as the mother who carried them, but as their mother. Permanently." Clara's breath hitched, James, I know it's a lot to ask, he continued, but I can't imagine doing this without you. I don't want to. Clara's emotions swirled in a chaotic mix of fear, joy, and disbelief. Are you saying you want us to be a family? James stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she nodded. Okay, she whispered. Yes. James pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as they stood in the nursery. For the first time, the future felt less like an uncertain promise and more like a solid foundation. A new chapter begins. As Clara's due date approached, James threw himself into preparing for their new life together. He renovated part of the mansion to create a more family-friendly space and began spending more time at home. Evelyn often caught him humming to himself as he worked, a small smile playing on his lips. Clara, meanwhile, continued her online classes, determined to finish her degree even as her pregnancy progressed. James supported her every step of the way, often quizzing her on legal concepts during their evenings together. Their relationship deepened with each passing day, built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared dreams, and a kind of love that grew quietly but fiercely. The storm had passed, both outside and within. And as they stood on the precipice of a new chapter, Clara and James realized they had found something far greater than they ever could have imagined. A family. When everything changes. The days leading up to Clara's delivery were a whirlwind of preparation, anticipation, and unexpected emotions. James had transformed from a stoic businessman into a devoted soon-to-be father, involved in every detail of the final weeks. Yet the undercurrent of fear lingered between them, fear of what the arrival of the baby would mean, and whether their fragile, newfound bond could withstand the changes ahead. An unexpected visitor. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Clara was in the garden, her swollen belly resting against the floral-patterned cushion of a chair. She was reading through case law for her latest online assignment when Evelyn approached, her expression uncertain. "Clara," Evelyn said hesitantly, "there's someone at the gate asking to see you." Clara frowned, setting her book aside. "Who?" "She says her name is Lauren. She claims to be your sister." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen Lauren in years, not since their family had fallen apart under the weight of medical bills and loss. She hadn't even known Lauren was alive, let alone where she was. "Let her in," Clara said, her voice trembling. Minutes later, Lauren stood before her, thinner and more weathered than Clara remembered, but undeniably her sister. For a moment, they simply stared at each other before Lauren burst into tears and pulled Clara into a careful hug. "I thought I'd lost you," Lauren whispered. "I thought the same about you," Clara replied, her own tears streaming down her face. James, who had been watching from the window, gave them space but couldn't help feeling protective. When Clara introduced him to Lauren later that evening, he greeted her with cautious warmth, though his sharp gaze suggested he was evaluating her intentions. Lauren explained that she had been living in a small town a few hours away, working odd jobs to get by. When she'd heard about Clara's situation from mutual acquaintances, she had scraped together the courage to come and find her. "I just wanted to see you," Lauren said, her voice thick with emotion. "To know you were okay." Clara reached across the table to squeeze her sister's hand. "I'm better than okay. I've missed you, Lauren." James, ever pragmatic, offered Lauren a place to stay temporarily in the guest house. Clara beamed at him, grateful for his generosity, though she couldn't help but notice the tension in his jaw as the evening wore on. The final preparations. As Clara's due date loomed, James's protectiveness intensified. He hovered over her constantly, ensuring she rested enough, ate well, and avoided stress. Even Evelyn noticed, teasing him about acting like an overbearing father-to-be. "He's a changed man," Evelyn whispered to Clara one afternoon. "This baby, and you, have brought out a side of him none of us ever thought we'd see." Clara smiled, though she felt the weight of those words. She didn't just see the change in James, she felt it every time he looked at her, every time he brushed his hand against hers as they walked through the garden or laughed together in the library. One evening, as they sat by the fire, James surprised her with a question. "Have you thought about names?" Clara raised an eyebrow. "I thought that was your department." "I want your input," James said, his voice soft. "This isn't just my child. It's ours." Clara's heart swelled. She hesitated for a moment before offering, "What about Grace, if it's a girl?" "For my mother." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And for a boy." Clara smiled. "How about Theodore? It means gift from God." James reached for her hand, his eyes warm. "Grace or Theodore? Perfect. A night to remember." The night everything changed began like any other. Clara had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day of preparations and a particularly long session of Braxton Hicks contractions. James stayed up late, working in his study, but keeping his phone close in case Clara needed him. At 2:14 a.m., it rang. "James," Clara's voice came through, breathless and strained. "I think it's time." James was by her side in minutes, helping her into the car as Evelyn grabbed the overnight bag they had packed weeks ago. The drive to the hospital was tense, the air thick with anticipation and fear. Clara gripped James's hand tightly, her breathing uneven as the contractions intensified. "Just breathe," James said, though his own voice wavered. "We're almost there." At the hospital, a team of nurses whisked Clara into a private suite. James stayed by her side through it all, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement as the hours dragged on. "It hurts," Clara gasped during a particularly brutal contraction. "James, I can't." "You can," he said firmly, his voice breaking. "You're the strongest person I know, Clara. You've got this." Finally, at 7:47 a.m., the cries of a baby filled the room. Clara collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as the nurse placed a tiny, squirming bundle in her arms. "It's a girl," the nurse said with a smile. James stood frozen, his eyes locked on the baby as Clara gently cradled her. "James," Clara said softly, looking up at him, "meet Grace." He moved closer, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Clara smiled through her tears. "She's ours." The first day as a family. Later that day, as Clara rested, James sat by the window holding Grace. The tiny baby had already claimed his heart in a way he hadn't thought possible. He gazed down at her, marveling at her delicate features and the way her tiny fingers curled around his thumb. Clara stirred and opened her eyes, smiling as she saw the two of them together. "You look good with her," she said, her voice soft. James looked up, his expression unguarded. "I never thought I could feel this way, Clara. About her. About you." Clara reached for his hand. "Neither did I. But here we are." James leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you too," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. In that moment, the boundaries they had once clung to dissolved completely. They weren't just two people brought together by a contract anymore. They were a family, a town transformed. Word of Grace's birth spread quickly, and the town was abuzz with excitement. James, once known as the distant and aloof billionaire, was now seen as a devoted father and partner. Clara, who had once been a struggling law student on the streets, was now a symbol of resilience and hope. At the suggestion of Lauren, James and Clara began hosting community events at their estate, inviting families and children from all walks of life. They partnered with local organizations to provide scholarships, housing assistance, and mentorship programs, determined to give others the second chance they had found together. As Clara watched James cradling Grace in the nursery one evening, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Their journey had been anything but conventional, but it had led them to something extraordinary. "This is just the beginning," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. James looked up, smiling. "What did you say?" Clara shook her head, smiling back. "Nothing. Just, thank you." "For what?" "For everything." James crossed the room, wrapping his free arm around her as they both gazed down at their sleeping daughter. "No, Clara," he said softly. "Thank you." A legacy of love. The weeks following Grace's birth were a blur of sleepless nights, tender moments, and an overwhelming sense of joy. James and Clara quickly learned the rhythms of parenthood: midnight feedings, diaper changes, and the simple wonder of watching their daughter sleep. Despite the challenges, they thrived, their bond strengthening with every shared moment. But life, as it often does, had its own plans. What had started as a private journey between the two of them and their baby soon grew into something much larger, something that would touch the entire community and beyond. The spark of an idea. One morning, James sat at the kitchen table, cradling Grace in his arms, while Clara worked on an assignment for her law class. The sunlight streaming through the windows bathed the room in a warm glow, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. "I've been thinking," James said, breaking the silence. Clara looked up, smiling at the sight of him gently rocking their daughter. "That's dangerous," she teased. James chuckled, but his expression turned serious. "I want to do something more. For the community. For people like you who deserve a second chance." Clara tilted her head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I've been talking to some of my contacts," James explained. "What if we created a foundation? A place where people could get the support they need. Housing, education, childcare, job training. A comprehensive center to help them rebuild their lives." Clara's eyes lit up. "That's incredible, James, but it's a big undertaking." James shrugged, a determined gleam in his eye. "I have the resources, and I have you. I think we can do this." Clara reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "You're not just thinking about it. You're really going to do it, aren't you?" James nodded. "I want to give back. Because of you, I've learned what's truly important, and I want to share that with others." Building a dream. Over the next several months, James and Clara poured their energy into creating the Thornton Family Foundation. They chose a location in the heart of the city, renovating a large, abandoned warehouse into a state-of-the-art facility that would house transitional apartments, classrooms, daycare centers, and more. Clara, with her legal expertise and personal experience, became the face of the project, working tirelessly to ensure that every detail was carefully planned. James handled the financial side, securing funding and partnerships from other philanthropists and local businesses. Together, they formed a formidable team. Lauren, inspired by her sister's transformation, stepped in to help run the day-to-day operations of the foundation. She found purpose in mentoring young women who, like Clara, had once been lost, but were now searching for hope. The grand opening of the Thornton Family Foundation was a day to remember. Hundreds of people gathered to celebrate, including city officials, community leaders, and former residents who had already benefited from James and Clara's generosity. As they stood on the stage, holding Grace between them, Clara looked out at the crowd and felt an overwhelming sense of pride. "This is more than just a building," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is a place where lives will be rebuilt, where families will be reunited, where dreams will be rediscovered. And I'm proud to say that this is only the beginning." The crowd erupted into applause, and James leaned over to kiss her cheek. "You're amazing," he whispered. "So are you," Clara replied, tears glistening in her eyes. A growing family. As the foundation thrived, so did the Thornton family. Grace was growing quickly, her bright blue eyes and curious nature captivating everyone she met. But she wasn't the only child filling their home with laughter and love. 2 years after Grace was born, Clara and James welcomed twin boys, Alexander and Henry. Their arrival brought chaos and joy in equal measure, turning the mansion into a lively haven filled with the sounds of little feet and infectious giggles. Despite their busy lives, James and Clara made a point to spend quality time together, often retreating to the garden in the evenings to reflect on their journey. It was during one of these quiet moments that James surprised Clara with a question that would once again change their lives. "Do you ever think about expanding the foundation?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Clara smiled, leaning into him. "I think about it all the time." "Why?" James turned to her, his eyes filled with excitement. "What if we took it nationwide? Created centers in cities across the country?" Clara's breath caught. "James, that's huge." "I know," he said, taking her hand. "But I think we can do it, together." Clara's heart swelled with love and admiration for the man who had once been so guarded, so focused on his own success, and who had now dedicated his life to helping others. "Let's do it," she said, her voice firm. "The heart of the community." The next few years were a whirlwind of activity as James and Clara expanded the Thornton Family Foundation to cities across the nation. Each new center brought stories of transformation and hope. Families reunited, individuals finding stability, and communities coming together to support one another. Back at home, the Thornton children grew up surrounded by the values their parents held dear. Grace, Alexander, and Henry often accompanied James and Clara to foundation events, learning firsthand the importance of kindness, compassion, and giving back. One day, as they toured a newly opened center, Grace tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she said, her voice filled with curiosity, "why do we help so many people?" James knelt down to her level, his eyes shining. "Because helping others makes the world a better place, sweetheart, and it makes our hearts full." Grace nodded, seeming to understand. "Then I want to help people too." Clara, watching from nearby, felt her chest tighten with emotion. Their children were growing up in a world shaped by love and generosity, and it was the greatest gift they could have given them. A legacy of love. Years later, as James and Clara stood on the balcony of their home, now bustling with the energy of teenagers and visiting friends, they reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The mansion, once a cold and empty space, was now filled with life, warmth, and laughter. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" Clara asked, leaning against James. James chuckled, wrapping his arm around her. "How could I forget? A contract. A deal." Clara laughed softly. "It's funny, isn't it? How something so impersonal turned into this." James kissed her forehead. "It's not funny. It's fate." As the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Clara rested her head on James's shoulder and smiled. Their story was one of second chances, of love found in the most unexpected of places, and of a legacy that would live on in the hearts of everyone they had touched. This wasn't the end of their story. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with endless possibilities and boundless love. A full circle. The Thornton mansion, once a symbol of solitude, now hummed with life. The children's laughter echoed through its halls, spilling out into the gardens where they played. Grace, now 6, was an inquisitive and compassionate child, often leading her younger brothers, Alexander and Henry, on imaginative adventures. The once empty home was now a sanctuary of love, warmth, and purpose. But for James and Clara, life was more than family and success. The Thornton Family Foundation had grown beyond their wildest dreams. With over a dozen centers across the country, the foundation had become a beacon of hope for countless families. Yet, as their lives expanded outward, they found themselves reflecting inward on how far they had come. The anniversary celebration. The day marked both a personal and public milestone. The 10-year anniversary of the Thornton Family Foundation and the 6th birthday of their daughter, Grace. The foundation hosted a gala in their flagship center, a grand celebration filled with testimonials, performances, and the unveiling of new expansion plans. Clara, radiant in an emerald green gown, stood by James on the stage. She held Grace's hand while Alexander and Henry stood beside their father, their matching ties slightly crooked from a game of tag earlier in the evening. When it was Clara's turn to speak, she stepped forward, glancing at James and their children before addressing the crowd. 10 years ago, this foundation began as a simple idea, a dream to give others the second chance I was given. Clara began, her voice steady despite the emotions welling inside her. But it has become so much more than that. It's a testament to the power of kindness, the strength of community, and the belief that no matter where you come from or what you faced, you can build a brighter future. She turned to James, her voice softening. And none of this would have been possible without the man who saw potential where others saw despair. James, you didn't just change my life. You gave me the courage to dream again. The crowd erupted in applause as James pulled Clara into an embrace. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Clara often says I gave her a second chance. James said, his gaze fixed on her. But the truth is, she gave me one. She taught me what it means to love, to hope, and to live for something greater than myself. And together, we've built a family and a legacy I could never have imagined. As James's words echoed through the hall, Grace tugged on her mother's hand and whispered, "Does this mean we're the luckiest family in the world?" Clara crouched down, smiling at her daughter. "Yes, Grace, it does." A quiet reflection. Later that evening, after the gala had ended and the children had been tucked into bed, James and Clara found themselves on the balcony of their mansion, a place where they often came to reflect. The city lights glittered in the distance, and the soft hum of crickets filled the air. "I was thinking about the first time I saw you," James said, breaking the silence. "You were sitting on that corner, reading a book, completely lost in the story. You didn't even look up when people passed by." Clara laughed softly. "I remember that book. It was Pride and Prejudice. I'd read it a dozen times, but it still made me feel hopeful." "You didn't know it then," James continued, "but you changed my life that day. You reminded me that hope is worth chasing." Clara leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "And you showed me that it's okay to let someone in, to believe in second chances." They stood in comfortable silence, the weight of their journey filling the space between them. Finally, Clara turned to James, her eyes shining. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't met?" she asked. James shook his head. "I don't let myself think about that. Because I know one thing for certain. My life would have been empty without you." Clara smiled, her heart full. "You're my second chance, James. My greatest gift. A legacy beyond measure." The years passed, and the Thornton family continued to grow, not in numbers, but in impact. Grace, Alexander, and Henry grew up learning the values their parents had instilled in them: compassion, resilience, and the importance of giving back. By the time they reached adulthood, each of them had found ways to carry on their family's legacy, from running new centers to advocating for social change on a global scale. James and Clara, now older but no less in love, watched their children step into their own roles with pride. The Thornton Family Foundation flourished, touching lives across the world and cementing their family's place as a force for good. The final chapter. On their 20th wedding anniversary, James and Clara returned to the corner where their story had begun. The once bustling street was now part of a revitalized neighborhood, thanks to the foundation's efforts. A small park had replaced the old bus stop, complete with benches and a plaque dedicated to the foundation's work. As they sat together, hand in hand, Clara traced the engraved words on the plaque. "Second chances change everything." "It's true," Clara said softly. "They do." James kissed her hand, his eyes warm. "You were my second chance, Clara, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I deserved it." Tears filled Clara's eyes, but they were tears of joy, of gratitude, of love. She rested her head against James's shoulder, feeling the weight of their journey and the beauty of the life they had built together. And as the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, the Thornton family story stood as a testament to the power of love, hope, and the extraordinary gift of a second chance.